Chapter 6 of the Hampstead Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Hampstead Mystery by John Watson and Arthur Rees. Chapter 6. There was unpleasant news for Inspector Chippenfield when Miss Fewbanks arrived at Riversbrook, accompanied by the housekeeper, Mrs. Hewson. In the first place, he learnt with considerable astonishment that it was Miss Fewbanks' intention to stay in the house until after the funeral, and for that purpose she had brought the housekeeper to keep her company in the lonely old place. Although they had taken up their quarters in the opposite wing of the rambling mansion to that in which the dead body lay, it seemed to Inspector Chippenfield, whose mind was very impressionable where the fair sex was concerned, that Miss Fewbanks must be a very peculiar girl to contemplate staying in the same house with the body of her murdered father for nearly a week. He was convinced that she must be a strong-minded young woman, and he did not like strong-minded young women. He preferred the weak and clinging type of the sex as more of a compliment to his own sturdy manliness. His unfavourable impression of Miss Fewbanks was deepened when he saw her and heard what she had to tell him. The girl had come up from the country filled with horror at the crime which had deprived her of her father, and firmly determined to leave no stone unturned to bring the murderer to justice. It was true that she and her father had lived on terms of partial estrangement for some time past because of his manner of life, but all the girl's feelings of resentment against him had been swept away by the news of his dreadful death, and all she remembered now was that he was her father and had been brutally murdered. When she sent for Inspector Chippenfield she had visited the room in which lay the body of her father. It had been placed in a coffin which was resting on the undertaker's trestles in the bay embrasure of the big room with the folding doors. There was nothing in the appearance of the corpse to suggest that a crime had been committed, but it had been impossible for the undertaker's men to erase entirely the distortion of the features so that they might suggest the cold, calm dignity of a peaceful death. The ordeal of looking on the dead body of her father had nerved her to carry through resolutely the task of discovering the author of the crime. She awaited the coming of the inspector in a small sitting room, and when he entered she pointed quickly to a chair but remained standing herself. In appearance Miss Fewbanks was a charming girl of the typical English type. She was of medium height, slight but well built, with fair hair and dark blue eyes, an imperious short upper lip and a determined chin, and the clear healthy complexion of a girl who has lived much out of doors. The inspector noted all these details, noted too that although her breast heaved with agitation she had herself well under control. Her pretty head was erect and one of her small hands was tightly clenched by her side. "Have you found out anything?" she asked the inspector as he entered. The girl had chosen a vague word because she felt that there were many things which must come to light in unravelling the crime. But from the police point of view of Inspector Chippenfield, the question whether he had found out anything was a stinging reflection on his ability. "I consider it inadvisable to make any arrest at the present stage of my investigations," he said with cold official dignity. "Do you think you know who did it?" asked the girl. "It is my business to find out," replied the inspector in a voice that indicated confidence in his ability to perform the task. The girl was too unsophisticated to follow the subtle workings of official pride. The papers call it a mysterious crime. Do you think it is mysterious?" "There are certainly some mysterious features about it," said the inspector, "but I do not regard them as insoluble. Nothing is insoluble," he added in a sententious tone. "If there are mysteries to be solved you ought to have help," said the young lady. She glanced at Mrs. Hewson significantly, and then proceeded to explain to Inspector Chippenfield what she meant. "I have asked Mr. Crewe, the celebrated detective, to assist you. Of course you know Mr. Crewe. Everybody does. I know you are a very clever man at your profession, but in a thing of this kind two clever men are better than one. I hope you will not mind. There is no reflection whatever on your ability. In fact, I have the utmost confidence in you, but it is due to my father's memory to do all that is possible to get to the bottom of this dreadful crime. If money is needed it will be forthcoming. That applies to you no less than to Mr. Crewe. But I hope you will be able to carry out your investigations amicably together, and that you will be willing to assist one another. You will lose nothing by doing so. I trust you will place at Mr. Crewe's disposal all the facilities that are available to you as an officer of the police." This statement was so clear that Inspector Chippenfield had no choice but to face the conclusion that Miss Fewbanks had more faith in the abilities of a private detective to unravel the mystery than she had in the resources of Scotland Yard. He would have liked to have told the young lady what he thought of her interfering with his work, and he determined to avail himself of the right opportunity to do so if it came along. But the statement that money was not to be spared had a soothing influence on his feelings. Of course, officers of Scotland Yard were not allowed to take gratuities however substantial they might be, but there were material ways of expressing gratitude which were outside the regulation of the department. "I shall be very pleased to give Mr. Crewe any assistance he wants," said Inspector Chippenfield, bowing stiffly. It was seldom that he took a subordinate fully into his confidence, but after he left Miss Fewbanks he flung aside his official pride in order to discuss with Rolfe the enlistment of the services of Crewe. Rolfe was no less indignant than his chief at the intrusion of an outsider into their sphere. Crewe was an exponent of the deductive school of crime investigation, and had first achieved fame over the Abingdon case some years ago, when he had succeeded in restoring the kidnapped heir of the Abingdon estates after the police had failed to trace the missing child. In detective stories the attitude of members of Scotland Yard to the deductive expert is that of admiration based on conscious inferiority. But in real life the experts of Scotland Yard have the utmost contempt for the deductive experts and their methods. The disdainful pity of the deductive experts for the rule of thumb methods of the police is not to be compared with the vigorous scorn of the official detective for the rival who has not had the benefit of police training. "Look here, Rolfe," said Inspector Chippenfield, "we mustn't let Crewe get ahead of us in this affair, or we'll never hear the last of it. It is scandalous of a man like Crewe, who has money of his own and could live like a gentleman, coming along and taking the bread out of our mouths by accepting fees and rewards for hunting after criminals. Of course, I know they say he is lavish with his money and gives away more than he earns, but that's all bosh. He sticks it in his own pocket right enough. One thing is certain, he gets paid whether he wins or loses. That is to say, he gets his fee in any case, but of course if he wins something will be added to his fee. In the meantime all you and I get is our salaries, and, as you know, the pay of an inspector isn't what it ought to be." Rolfe assured his superior of his own